Have you ever just stopped to think about how a collection of texts, written by dozens of different authors, spread over thousands of years, across completely different continents and cultures, could possibly piece together into one continuous narrative? I mean, it sounds literally impossible, right? Yet, when we look closely at the texts of the Old and New Testaments, this highly structured, overarching storyline actually emerges. It's like a giant puzzle coming together. Today, we're going to trace that exact thread.
Welcome to The Explainer. I am so pumped you're here with us today. We are focusing on the biblical meta-narrative. Our goal here is to simply look at the source material and track the historical and theological storylines straight across these ancient texts. We'll examine how these writings outline a fundamental problem of humanity, a persistent promise of redemption, a proposed solution, and the massive real-world impact that framework had on the ancient world.
Okay, let's dive into this. We are going to hit 5 key phases today: the fall and the exile, the suffering servant and shepherd, parables of the lost, justification by grace and faith, and finally, the message spreads. Just to make sure we keep our bearings, here is the historical flow we'll be tracking. We'll start at the very beginning in Eden, move right through the era of the prophets, transition into the life and teachings of Jesus, and wrap up with the explosive growth of the early church. It's a vast chronological journey for sure, but the thematic connections are absolutely incredible.
All right, Section 1. The Fall and the Exile, the Genesis conflict.
To really get the rest of this narrative, we first have to examine the origin of the conflict. Genesis 3 lays out this cascading series of events that sets up the central problem: the breaking of the relationship between God and humanity. It picks off with deception. A crafty serpent tells Eve, you won't die, you'll actually become like God. This leads directly to disobedience. And interestingly, the text points out that their very first realization wasn't some newfound power. No, it was shame. They realize they're naked and they literally try to hide. The consequence here is profound. The ground is cursed and humanity faces exile from Eden. This exile, it is the foundational conflict that the rest of the 65 books are actively seeking to resolve.
Moving on to Section 2, the suffering servant and shepherd, the promise revealed.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the texts introduce a prophetic tradition pointing toward a solution following that exile. And it's fascinating how insanely specific these prophetic texts become. In the book of Isaiah, specifically chapter 53, we get this vivid, honestly haunting prophecy of a suffering servant. The text notes that humanity, kind of like sheep, has gone completely astray. But instead of humanity paying the price for this exile and disobedience, this servant bears the pain. He's described as being despised, rejected, pierced for transgressions, crushed for iniquities. The text proposes a wildly radical idea here, that by the suffering and wounds of this one single servant, the peace and healing of the many are actually achieved.
Flash forward hundreds of years after Isaiah, and the New Testament texts pick up this exact imagery. Over in the Gospel of John, Jesus steps up and claims the title of the Good Shepherd. He directly contrasts himself with hired hands, the guys who just run away the second a wolf attacks. Instead, Jesus says that as the Good Shepherd, he knows his sheep by name, they recognize his voice, and most importantly, he willingly lays down his life for the flock. The connection to Isaiah is absolutely unmistakable. The servant who bears the suffering of the straying sheep is now portrayed as the shepherd actively sacrificing himself to save them.
All right, Section 3, Parables of the Lost, the Search for the Scattered. To really humanize this theology and explain the why behind the shepherd's arrival, the texts give us these incredibly relatable narratives. In Luke chapter 15, Jesus gets criticized by people who are furious that he's eating with quote-unquote sinners. So how does he answer them? He drops 3 back-to-back stories that share the exact same narrative arc. First, a shepherd leaves his flock of 99 in the open country just to search for one lost sheep. Now, from a strict agricultural standpoint, leaving 99 sheep unprotected is terrible economics, but that is exactly the point. The narrative uses this radical pursuit to illustrate a divine motive. Next, a woman sweeps her entire house late at night just to find a single lost silver coin. Finally, a father constantly watches the horizon for his lost son, who squandered his inheritance in wild living, and when he sees him, he runs to embrace him and throws a massive feast. The ultimate takeaway, repeated over and over in these texts, is that there is huge rejoicing in heaven over even one person who repents. The whole motive of the meta-narrative is presented as an active, relentless search for the lost.
But this search requires a totally profound transformation on the individual's part, which is explored in this fascinating midnight dialogue in John chapter 3. You have this prominent religious leader, Nicodemus, sneaking out to come to Jesus under the cover of darkness. And Jesus tells him something that completely baffles him. He says to see the kingdom of God, one must be born again. Well, Nicodemus takes it completely literally. He's asking how in the world someone can enter their mother's womb a second time. But Jesus explains it's a metaphorical spiritual necessity, a new birth of water and the Spirit. The text basically presents this as a complete hard reset of the human condition, tracing the solution all the way back to the initial fall in Eden.
Which brings us to Section 4, Justification by Grace and Faith, the Theological Mechanism.
And this brilliantly illustrates the big question. How does this reset actually work? Well, the epistles of Paul lay out the mechanics of this core argument, specifically in Romans and Galatians. Paul pits two systems against each other. On one side, you have the works of the law. The text argues that the ancient law cannot save anyone. It merely brings a consciousness of sin. Relying on sheer human effort to flawlessly keep the law, it just leaves people under a curse because, well, no one is perfectly righteous. On the flip side is justification by faith. This isn't described as a wage you earn. It's a completely free gift of grace. Through faith in what Christ did, individuals receive abundant justification, which brings real peace with God and radically unites completely different groups of people.
This unification is a massive, game-changing theme. Over in Ephesians 2, Paul explains that this mechanism of grace actually creates a new humanity. Think about the ancient world for a second. The cultural and religious divide between Jews and Gentiles was immense, almost insurmountable. But the text states that Christ completely destroyed that exact barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, reconciling both groups to God through the cross. They're not foreigners or strangers to one another anymore. They are fellow citizens built together into a dwelling where God lives by His Spirit.
And the practical, everyday application of this justification is mapped out so beautifully in Romans 5. The text argues that believers can now boast in the hope of God's glory, but it goes even further. It breaks down a literal chain reaction, teaching readers to view even their daily struggles in a totally new light. The text says that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character, that produces hope. And this hope does not put them to shame. It's presented as a framework specifically designed to build profound psychological and spiritual resilience. And that leads us to our final stop, Section 5, The Message Spreads, a Living Hope.
Let's look at the real-world, historical impact of this theology out in the wild. We see how deeply this conviction fueled the early church, even when they were facing fierce imprisonment and persecution. In Acts 26, Paul is literally on trial, standing before King Agrippa. He recounts his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus and defends his actions. When the king sarcastically asks if Paul thinks he can persuade him to be a Christian in such a short time, Paul fires back with this incredibly bold line. Despite being an actual prisoner, his unwavering defense and genuine desire is that everyone listening might share his faith, just, without the chains. It shows an unshakable confidence in the meta-narrative he's preaching.
We also see the early church actively connecting these ancient texts to their present day in real time. In Acts 8, there's this amazing anecdote of Philip being directed to a desert road where he meets an Ethiopian official sitting in a chariot. And what is the official reading? The scroll of Isaiah, specifically the exact passage about the sheep led to the slaughter that we discussed earlier. Philip asks if he understands it and then uses that very passage of Isaiah 53 to explain the good news about Jesus. Boom! It results in immediate understanding, a roadside baptism, and the Ethiopian continuing his journey rejoicing. The promised solution from antiquity was actively transforming lives in the present.
Finally, you've got Peter's letters, showing how this narrative demanded a completely transformed way of life. Peter writes to exiles scattered all over the place, reminding them that they have been born again into a living hope. We see exactly how early Christians were instructed to act based on this source material. He tells them their faith will be proven genuine through trials, kind of like how gold is refined by fire. Because of this, they're given a direct command to escape the world's corruption, to participate in the divine nature, and to be holy, because the God who called them is holy. The text calls them to live out this theology as reverent foreigners possessing a real, enduring hope.
So what does this all mean? The crucial point is that whether we are looking at a garden in Genesis, a prophet in Isaiah, a midnight conversation in John, or a literal prison defense in Acts, these texts are highly coordinated around this one central theme of exile and redemption. It's pretty amazing, and it leaves us with a fascinating question to ponder. How does this ancient framework of grace, faith, and reconciliation continue to influence modern moral and philosophical thought today? Think about that as you reflect on the incredible structure of this historical meta-narrative. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep seeking, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.